Good afternoon. Uh-oh, did everybody have too much lunch already? Good afternoon. All right, last time, on third time's always the best time. Good afternoon. All right, the best panel we're going to have today is going to start right now. I've got two very good friends. I've known them for a long time. I want to say I knew them when they were young, Doug Becker and Chris Hoehn-Saric. You guys know them as among the most interesting and innovative entrepreneurs in the education space. Many of you first got to know Doug and Chris when they founded Sylvan Learning Systems, which became one of the largest education companies in the US and grew all around the world. Some of you got to know them here in this market where they've been for almost 25 years. Hard to think about that, but in a variety of businesses, from Prometric, a testing business, to Meritas, a high school and K-12 business, which was sold recently to Nord Anglia, to Laureate Education, higher ed. So they've gotten to know the space incredibly well. And I have to admit up front, they're not only friends, but they're also small investors in Aussie. So you know they're brilliant people. So really proud to be with them today. Doug, why don't I start with you? How did you guys decide to enter the Chinese market back in '94? Were you pulled into it? Were you going towards it? How did you end up looking at the Chinese market that early?
Well, the first time we started looking seriously about China was really in the pursuit of our testing business, Prometric. And I'm going to punt this one to Chris, who was really the founder of Prometric and was responsible for the entry into China. So Chris, maybe you want to cover this?
Sure. You know, it's as both Carlos and Doug have said, we've been really fortunate to have been involved in small ways in the China education marketplace since the mid-1990s, which was a time when we were just going through a process of change in China. And in that particular case, we had identified an opportunity around the world associated with converting standardized exams from paper and pencil format to a network of testing centers that ultimately would be about 5,000 testing centers in 150 countries. But in particular in China, as we all know, China has had a very long history of using exams for purposes of progression, both from a standpoint of academic as well as progression into government service for over 1,000 years. And in this particular case, the opportunity was around admissions tests to come into the United States. So we actually, at that point, entered into a joint venture with the Chinese government, with the Ministry of Education, specifically the National Education Exam Authority, to bring in and convert the TOEFL exam, GRE, and GMAT. And it became the foundation for electronic testing in China. And you know, without going through the full story, what I would say is it was a wonderful experience because we were early in the process of involving commercial businesses in China. It turned out, and it even today operates and continues to go forward, but we found it to be a really important, welcoming, and grounding experience that gave us confidence to continue to build businesses in China as an international and foreign investor.
Doug, as Chris is pointing out, you guys ended up building a variety of kinds of businesses in China. So you didn't just kind of find testing and stick with testing, but you ultimately diversified. Which of the 3 or 4 different kinds of education businesses have you been in has been the most interesting, or at least the most surprising to you?
Well, in addition to the testing, we did set up an international school as part of Meritas, which was in Chengdu, which was a great experience because the government was our partner, as often can be the case in certain education enterprises. In the case of Laureate, we're partners in a private university in Hunan province, and also were involved in the creation of one of the first foreign Chinese joint venture universities, which is in Suzhou. And that was, I'd say, our partner is the University of Liverpool. And that is, to my knowledge, the most successful foreign branch of a Western university anywhere in the world. And that's been a great experience. Again, government at the table in a way that's essential. And then one of my favorite experiences was the work with the Wall Street Institute, which is now Wall Street English, whose founder, Peccinini, is here in the audience somewhere under those lights, my very dear friend. And that has become one of China's most influential English language school chains. So each of these were completely unique experiences, but what they all had in common is the importance of understanding and aligning our objectives with the very intentional plans that government has for developing human talent. And in this country, if you can create that alignment, if you can listen carefully and understand what the government is trying to accomplish, really anything's possible.
Doug, I know you love not just business, but operating businesses. And I know that you get a particular joy from it, both intellectually and operationally. What has been required of successful entrepreneurs here versus some of the other countries you've been in? You just pointed to one of the things, but what other things, when you've been looking to hire people to work with you or engage partners, what have you looked for, if anything, that's different in your entrepreneurs here versus in Chile, versus in Angola, versus in parts of Europe that I know you've operated in?
Sure. Well, look, I think the biggest challenge for us in the case of Laureate, where I've spent much of my career, is scale. So Laureate has 1 million students. We have 70 universities. We have 80,000 employees. And people still tend to think about education as something that is handmade. And even, of course, technology ideas, the weapons of mass instruction, Mike, I thought was a brilliant way to put it. It's still, the idea may be scalable, but the business itself requires a scalable mindset in the types of people that you hire. And entrepreneurs typically are thinking about the idea and not necessarily thinking about the scalable model. For me, as an entrepreneur, I can't say I've mastered that, but I can say I understand deeply the importance of it, and have always tried to surround myself with people that can think and act that way. I think in the case of China, this is even more important now. You have the creation of enormously successful companies, highly capitalized, creating a very strong market, equity market for companies. And that works for a handful of the most sophisticated entrepreneurs. But behind them, at the base of the pyramid, is a group of incredibly creative, successful entrepreneurs who are going to hit this barrier of scale. And so I'd say my goal would be, and what we've done in Laureate, in many companies that Chris and I have backed over the years, would be to try to find a way to help some of those entrepreneurs break through that ceiling that would otherwise keep them from achieving a certain scale. Maybe it's understanding the transparency and reporting requirements of international investors. That's not an easy thing for a lot of local entrepreneurs, not just in China, but in any country in the world to understand. Or maybe it's about helping them think about the systems that they need to scale their business or the type of people. Those would be the things I've had to do in Laureate and really in all of our companies to get to a certain scale.
Chris, when people hear about the variety of kinds of companies you guys have had success with, it almost sounds a little made up, because often, people find one really good lane and go deep on that. But as you guys pointed out, from testing to English learning to high school to higher ed, you guys have had success. But where have you gotten it wrong? Over the last 25 years here in China,
we don't have enough time.
I was going to say that the list you gave, we got it wrong at some point in every one of those opportunities on things. So I'm not sure that there is a consistent theme of getting it wrong, but I do think that there are attributes which are necessary to be successful, as opposed to those that, because as we always say, we'd like to have more wins than we have losses, but there's definitely not something with a 100% win record. I do think that, especially when we think about issues around both changing marketplaces and places, especially now when we have things like technology really being the centerpiece of disruption in education, I think it's quite possible that you can be wrong within an iteration of what you're doing. So when we think about this, a lot of times this is about strengthening one's hand to win, which is about surrounding yourself with an incredibly capable team, making sure that you have the financial resources to take multiple bites at the apple, so that you're not really dependent on doing it once right, but that you have a couple of times to be able to do it. So I think in that respect, the idea of going into battle well armed with people and capital and an understanding of the markets that you're pursuing are the kind of ingredients that are there for us.
Doug, if I were to give you a do-over, what would be your do-over? Was there an investment you should have made that you passed on? Was there a market that you tried that you guys didn't quite get right? What would your do-over be if I gave you a mulligan?
The problem is that if you wait long enough, anything that looks like it would have been successful may eventually fail, and anything that looks like it was going to fail may eventually be successful. And so the problem with us doing this, as long as we have I don't even know anymore. There have been things that just look terrible, and then they succeeded beyond my expectations. I would say, look, the common pattern for trouble is if you don't have staying power. If you have the staying power, which is financial staying power and really emotional staying power, because as an entrepreneur, it's, you're watering the garden, as I say, with the blood from your own veins. And that's devotion, that's commitment, that's passion, but it is literally draining. And if you run out of that energy because you're not getting the feedback that you need, the success in the market, the response from customers, the support of investors. I'll give you one example. When I had the idea of creating this international network of universities that was Laureate, I went to probably 20 experts in education and international relations. And the first 19 of them told me that it was a terrible idea. And the last guy, this very sort of famous educator named Joe Duffy, I went to lunch with him, and he loved the idea. He worked in the White House for President Clinton. He literally gave his notice, left the government, and came to work with me. But honestly, if that lunch hadn't gone well, I think I was done. I didn't know it at the time. I don't think he knew it. But I really was almost at the end of my staying power. So it's staying power to believe in your ideas. Often it's financial staying power. One of the great things I think Chris and I are so grateful for is not only having developed our own base of capital, but because we also manage a lot of funds for other investors, we are in a position to help entrepreneurs have the staying power to be successful, because otherwise there's really almost no failure that can't be overcome if you can take the time to correct it. If you're meeting a real market need, and I'd say one mistake I don't think we've made very often, we haven't tried to start businesses where there wasn't a very clear problem to be solved. But execution mistakes, the list would go on far beyond the clock that we have here. But we've always, I think, been able to adapt and reposition and recover.
Talk about other markets. While China has been a place you've had a lot of success, part of what always intrigues me about the businesses you guys have built is you guys have probably operated meaningfully in, 30 or 40 countries?
Maybe even more.
Even more. Other than China, give me 2 or 3 other countries that have either challenged you in unusual ways or have given you unusual opportunities.
Well, look, for me, the big surprise in the work at Laureate has been really the opportunities in Latin America. So Laureate today, which is a, let's say, $4.5 billion revenue company, more than half of that comes from 4 big Latin American countries: Mexico, Brazil, Peru, and Chile. And I've been amazed to see the story in Latin America is the story of a rising middle class. Now, we see that all over the world. But in some ways, the consistency and the scale, the breathtaking speed at which people have been lifted out of poverty there is actually underestimated by the world that tends to see success in Asia, for example, where you see this rise of wealth and success. And of course, it's true. But for us and for our product in education, it's been warmly received, not always, but usually, in those markets to a point that far surpassed my expectations. To think that a company of our scale, we're in 28 countries at Laureate, and that more than half of our revenue comes from 4 Latin American countries, I would have never predicted.
Chris, look forward for us. You guys, again, have had a tremendous track record here in China, but as you think about the next 25 years, what excites you or maybe even what scares you as you think about the road for education entrepreneurs here?
I think what excites me is the same foundation that all of the businesses that here are there, which is a clear recognition by both consumers and government that the path toward economic success and progression is really centered around educational attainment. That at the core, I think, is a consistent belief that's gone from a generalized understanding to now specific policy around the world. So I think there are very few places where that's now not a recognized underpinning for both policy and the opportunities on things. I think the technology in general as both, call it a supportive, disruptive force in the delivery of education it's there. I don't think there's a question as to whether or not it's going to have significant impact. And the gating issue of success in technology is overcoming the existing systems. And if I thought about a push and pull issue is, in many marketplaces, technology can easily affect how a market behaves. Because education is central often to government function or to established practices in the way that things work, it tends to be a slower impact. Nonetheless, when I think of the generational opportunities, technology is one of them. And then finally, I would say that perhaps the two most important markets, China and the United States, on some combined basis, because we have a flow of intellectual capital back and forth, a flow of people and opportunities, technology and processes, both directions. I think this bilateral opportunity and how it expresses itself is one of the big opportunities there.
Doug, as you think about education companies becoming more and more central, and Chris talked about some of the accelerators, do you think we'll see a $100 billion education company anytime soon? And if so, what country do you expect it would come out of, and what would you expect that company to be doing?
You mean market cap or
Market
revenue?
cap, yeah.
Look, the Chinese leaders, companies like TAL and New Oriental, have accomplished remarkable valuations. Although it is fair to say that over time, the investors will expect the companies to grow into their valuations. Most companies don't sustain multiples that high. They can sustain valuation that high by growing into their value. But over time, you do see all companies mature. And you can see an example of a company like Microsoft that now has a more traditional multiple, but still has a gigantic multi-$100 billion valuation. So that would be an example. It can work. If it's going to happen anywhere, it's going to happen in China. My concern would be is it's unlikely that it's going to happen in a single line of business education company. So it would really have to be a multi-line of business education company. And certainly in our experience, you lose a lot when you try to be a conglomerate in education. There is a benefit of specialization. And we've done it. And there were times when it really worked. And there were times when the market ceased to understand us and we lost our multiple. So 100 billion, that would be a big number. Could it happen? It would happen here in China if it's going to happen anywhere. Or you could see a Chinese company achieving its scale and market capitalization here and deciding to launch into the rest of the world. And that's something that would be very exciting to me because I would be ready to meet them and help them figure that out. Because the world, I think really that will happen. The flow of students is becoming global. It's not just a single domestic market. So it could happen. In fact, I was just going to tell you, the very beginning for us when we got interested in education, which was 30 years ago, I remember I was reading an interview with Mike Milken, who at that time, after pioneering the financial markets, was in jail and was writing about what he was going to do when he got out of jail. And I was reading an article and he said, I'm going to go into the education industry. It is the multi-$100 billion industry of the future. And I remember thinking, that was just breathtaking to me. But he thought big. He actually did a lot in the industry. I don't know that he's as active now as he was then, but it really grabbed my attention. This can be a multi-$100 billion industry. In many respects, it is. And I think if people are ambitious enough, somebody's going to create something pretty big.
Chris, for those who don't know the story, I'm always fascinated by how you and Doug and Eric and Stephen came together. Go back and tell us that story. How did the four of you become partners, and how did you guys end up in the education space itself?
Well, the brief version of it was that we all grew up around roughly the same age. We're going to school and college, and even before that, and ultimately found an opportunity early on in the United States in the healthcare industry around electronic medical records and electronic claims processing, which this was back in the mid-'80s. So we ended up forming a business. We had no personal resources. We had an idea, some background in technology, and perhaps the naiveness of not knowing where the boundaries were. We were able to convince a large health insurance company to actually back us personally to build that company. And they ultimately, and it had enough initial success that within a couple of years, they actually purchased our interest. And we used that original capital base, which in today's world has many fewer zeros than everybody has, but at the time represented a great starting point for us. We then moved into early technology education. This was, again, at a time when computer-based training was not even a concept that people were doing. And at that point in time, without going through all the details, I can tell you, we built a company where you had to write your own operating system, build your own hardware, and got involved early in what was computer-based training, and used that business to then buy Sylvan, start Prometric, start Laureate, get involved with a variety of things. And so I'd say that the journey we were on is a traditional entrepreneur's journey of finding a need and filling that need. And also using every opportunity to kind of find the next stepping stone. Where was the next problem going to be? And so I can remember, as just a short part of the journey, we were building Prometric, which was a business that was operating ultimately in 150 countries. And we had a large, call it big data company before big data, and a transaction SaaS company before SaaS companies were called it. One of the things that became so obvious to us as an example, as we watch people's lives going through various transitions, was how important, for instance, English language was becoming around the world. And it was that little moment of inspiration that Doug then was saying, okay, Chris, you're doing this, I'm gonna go take that strand of insight. And back at a time when, again, before English language became such a prominent business, that became the thread to pull on to ultimately then go partner with Pecci and build Wall Street. So I think for us, it's always been a journey of lily pads, finding the next one to leap to based upon the problem you see next.
Just to fill in how humble this started, though. So Chris and I went to high school together, and we started this first business. He was a senior in college. I was a senior in high school. I realized we look like we're the same age, but we're not. And the other thing is that he was my part-time boss at a computer store back when there used to be Computerland. I don't even think there is anywhere anymore. And we were hobbyists who built computers and had a lot of fun along the way. So the privilege to work together after all these years has been really just amazing.
And Doug, say more, because you had an opportunity to go to Harvard, if I remember correctly, and at a time in which, although Bill Gates had effectively dropped out, it still wasn't the norm for people to bypass a college opportunity, much less a college of that kind of renown. How did you decide to do that? Where were your parents on this whole thing? And ironically, you go on to become an education entrepreneur who skipped college.
Well, I think the idea for me wasn't, I didn't intend to not go to college. I intended to defer. And so I was lucky to have been accepted to Harvard. There's a long story even behind that. They actually rejected me the first time I applied, and I reapplied and told them that they had made a mistake. And they actually accepted me, which is one of life's great lessons that you have to ask. And then I asked for a year's deferral while we started this first business together, and they gave it to me. They said, you can come to school in a year. Then I asked for another deferral, and they gave me that. And then I asked for a third deferral, and they said either attend or reapply. And then life and work got very busy, and I never went. But it's certainly not something I recommend for others. I'm a big advocate of the power of higher education. I just ended up finding a way to get my education in a different way.
And Chris, how did you guys decide to split up? Because I love partnerships, whether it's in sports, whether it's in politics, whether whatever. I'm always intrigued about partners and partnerships that endure and that endure across long periods of time. How did you guys, and knowing all four of you a little bit, that wasn't a given that you guys would stick together and last. How did it work in retrospect?
I think of it as probably a function of knowing our personal strengths and weaknesses. And so Doug and I were co-CEO of Sylvan when we took it public, which was unusual. We've worked together for many years, and I would say there's virtually been never a point where it wasn't probably obvious to each of us where we could bring a particular strength to a situation and a weakness to a situation. So there were very few points of real conflict, and probably more just a recognition of where one of us does a job better than the other, but also being able to rely on the other person at all times. And one thing I'll say is we started out young, and we grew up together. And in growing up together, and we also came from the same place from the standpoint of family and resources, which is to say we didn't have any resources. So we started at an identical place in our lives and grew up together. We all had families together in a similar sequence. And I would say the key was really both recognizing, again, strengths and weaknesses, but also on the other side, having an inherent trust in the other person. So I always said, I know that Doug has my back and I have his back. And I know that under any circumstances, you trust your children with him, and I think of him as a brother. And that's really, call it the most important thing, which has grounded our partnership for so many years.
I would say, to make it simpler, I always recognized that Chris was smarter, and he always recognized that I was always right.
That's a good team that could laugh together. I like that too. What comes next, Doug? How do you see what you guys will do in this education space over the next decade or two?
Well, it's a really exciting moment because one of the challenges when you build businesses, you also take responsibility for them. So Laureate became really the biggest, most ambitious scale-up business that we started. And for a long time, it was really my responsibility and duty to stay with that. And as a result, I wasn't able to work on a daily basis with Chris the way we had for so many years before that. But in January, I'm going to be relinquishing the CEO role for Laureate, remaining as its chairman and its founder, and we'll have the time now to work more closely with Chris as we've done over so many years. And also, given that we've had 25 years of working here in China, I'm also very excited to spend more time here and to look for the right kind of opportunities. Entrepreneurs here who might benefit from the experience of scale and certainly from the many mistakes that we've made. No reason that they should have to make those mistakes all over again. So really eager to get back into business creation and the support and partnership with other entrepreneurs to give them the resources and experience that we can provide.
Chris, talk about gender here in China and what you've seen that may have either surprised you or intrigued you about how gender is played out here, whether it's played out in your customer base in interesting ways, whether it's played out in terms of your teams and management teams. And I don't ask this question with any predisposed...
No, I think it's interesting. And just as a matter of background, I'm actually half Chinese. And so, my mother was born in the Suzhou area. And so I have somewhat of a cultural connection that's gone back a long ways. And one of the things that has always been, I think, central to China has been opportunity that's not been gender specific. All societies go through transitions over time, but China's been pretty progressive in those areas. And so I would say, for instance, in the United States, my mother graduated from medical school, but she was one of 3 women in her class at Hopkins Medical School. Here in China, we've actually always had, in managerial roles and in other roles, there have been opportunities for both men and women. And I would say the same thing when it comes to the customer base. We all know there have been changes in every society if one went back 50 years. But I think, relatively speaking, China has actually been leading in the area of opportunity for everybody over many countries in the world.
But I think actually this is a global question, Carlos. The percentage of students who are female, as I look all over the world at almost every level of study, it is becoming more and more a majority female student base. And I think men should be very afraid. Earlier there was, I think maybe in Mike's presentation, he was talking about how at some point, I think the man from Y Combinator had said the government's going to have to start paying people who are not able to keep up with the workplace requirements. Those are going to be men. So they're going to be masses of unemployed people. They're going to be men. The dedication and hard work of female students all over the world is just showing up in the numbers as a majority female students in almost every educational institution.
What implications do you think that has for public policy? Because throughout the last 2 centuries, whenever we've seen large numbers of unemployed men, they've ended up being employed in war.
Yeah,
so how do you think about the public policy implications of that being true, combined with things like artificial intelligence and other things that may change our labor markets?
You know, I have to say at the moment it feels like such a good thing, because while Chris was mentioning that opportunities for women leaders in China have been, you know, pretty good, the world generally that has not been the case. So at the moment I think we're just more in a natural rebalancing, and it feels good to see the hard work of so many female students paying off. And let's face it, there will always be also a depletion of female contribution to the workplace because of women's opportunity, should they choose to participate in childbearing, which is something that men have not yet figured out how to do. So I think that it will probably even out for now, but if it continues, I think it is a problem. It is something, there's something about the motivation of male students that just doesn't seem to match up with the motivation of female students. We are going to have to do something about that.
You know, I also think, Carlos, that in a lot of places there has been a historic opportunity for jobs that are around issues of manual labor and where contribution through exclusively hard work in, call it, more trade-oriented careers have been the purview of males. And that is also a place one can retreat to. So for instance, right now in the United States, we are effectively at a full employment economy. So if you looked at the situation today, we don't have enough labor for almost any job that's there. And it's easy because we're going to fill out jobs today that, for instance, truck drivers in the United States. You have several million truck drivers in the United States, and we can't fill the jobs. There's simply not enough people, and on a relative skill level, it's relatively something that one can get trained for pretty quickly. However, if we just look downstream 10, 15 years at the ability to run automated cars and trucks on the roads, we may lose 500,000, 1 million, 1.5 million jobs, and the people that are involved there, who are mostly males, don't have a transferable skill set. They have a skill set driving trucks. And if that's the extent of your skill set, you can't become a computer programmer easily. So I think one of the challenge we have as a matter of policy, which has nothing to do with gender per se, is that higher education in general as an enabling set of skills that gives you the chance to move career to career is something that's critical. And if males end up pursuing largely trade jobs and more skewed for women pursuing higher education, which in the United States is happening right now, it sets the table for a significant challenge downstream as various job classifications get moved on.
Doug, let's go home to the United States for a moment. And you've had a very different regulatory environment there over the last 8 years, and there may be a change again. Talk about how that's impacted you. I know you guys have had good news at times. You guys also gotten touched up a little bit as well. Talk about that environment for your education businesses in the U.S. and what you see going forward.
It's a great question, Carlos. You know, I always thought about education as a regulated business, and of course there are parts of it that are highly regulated. What I have come to learn, which sounds so obvious that it took me so long to get to, I'm not sure why, is that of course regulations ultimately are a reflection of political trends and political will. And sometimes you have very rational, thoughtful plans laid out by government for where they want to take their society. China would be a great example. And you can count on that. And therefore, the industry of education can bank on where government is going. And then you have places like the United States where with a shorter political cycle, things can change. And we went from the government welcoming the participation of the private sector in higher education to being most unwelcome. I don't mean us in particular, but for-profit education overnight. And that was very, very painful. And the companies that were focused on student outcomes, on retention, on students who can repay their loans, like us, for example, we generally ended up okay. But it was a roller coaster and a very difficult experience, and it really changed the perception of education and made the private sector feel unwelcome. I think that's a very dangerous thing, because most students, when they graduate, are going to go into the private sector, and so a higher education system that welcomes the participation of the higher education of the private sector is I think, critical. But we've seen this in other countries. It goes back and forth. Right now, the current administration is very welcoming and sees the private sector as essential. The previous administration, not so much. And I'm sure it will change again in the future. I think we just needed to armor ourselves with great outcomes and to be able to prove that what we do is good for society.
Chris, give us your Forrest Gump story. Who are some of the interesting people who you guys have bumped into along the way? Because again, you guys started off at Entrepreneurs at a time in which there weren't accelerators and there weren't startup hubs, and Silicon Valley wasn't an iconic, powerful place, and there wasn't Silicon Alley and lots of other places. So you guys, I had a chance to talk to Mark Cuban earlier this year, and he was telling me about sitting down with a young Michael Dell at the time and saying, we're both going somewhere. And just the kinds of people who were entrepreneurs in those days, you know, fewer of you than there are today. So who are some of the interesting people who you guys crossed paths with back in the 80s and 90s as you guys were coming up and building your first sets of businesses?
You know, I'm trying to think of, you know, to your point on who are the interesting, there are lots of interesting people, and they're innovators that have been around the space. The person who just came and spoke, Chris Whittle, is somebody who I've always admired as both being a visionary and also being highly resilient to keep going after opportunities time and time again on things. And Chris has been in the education industry for 25 odd years or so, and with innovative models on things. So I think that you probably have seen some of the more mature operators in education today have been around for a long time. And as we say, the world is round, and you keep seeing the same people time and time again. But I'd say even early on, I remember we had opportunities to interact with Bill Gates very early on in our career, when he was still massively more successful and bigger than we were at the time, though he was this tall and we were this tall, and now he's much taller on things. And again, what you've seen, even in places like the intersection with technology and education, frankly, some of the technology leaders in the space have continued to be involved. You mentioned Lorraine Jobs and Steve Jobs, who for a generation participated in kind of innovative cycles associated with education. So I'm trying to think if there's anybody in particular who is striking. I guess what I'd say, when we look today at businesses that are the leaders at the given moment in time right now, and I look back, a number of them either worked with us early on or cut their teeth on businesses that we were involved in. And so, but you tend to see the same folks coming back again and again. And I think that's a function of compounding knowledge, where you have the ability to take experience and have it compound progressively in better execution. And it goes to sort of saying what Doug was saying, which is we've sort of entered that time when we look forward and say, how can we take the compounding both knowledge and avoidance of failure to actually try to contribute that to another generation?
I would just give one other example. I mentioned earlier Petchy, who was the founder of Wall Street Institute, who's somewhere under the lights. Truly a great inspiring example to me. Came here to China, started an English language school at a time when the regulatory system was very unclear. It survived the SARS experience when all schools were closed. Just resilient, unyielding, unrelenting, focused on his goal, and always interested in benefiting society. I learned so much from him and many, many others.
Doug, as we close out here, if you were able to go back and talk to young Doug, 16 years old, give him 2 or 3 pieces of advice on anything, maybe tied to entrepreneurship, may not kind of theoretically what you would tell him, but what would you really tell him if I gave you literally just 90 seconds with him and I gave you a chance to whisper in his ear, 90 seconds, you get to go back in time. What are you going to tell young Doug?
I would say stick to your guns. Don't give up. Things are hard. People aren't encouraging. Sometimes they are, but they often aren't. And as long as you really are listening to get people's advice, you also need to have the courage of your own conviction. And I think that's certainly been a great reinforced life lesson for me along those times. And then I think the other point is the importance of humility. There's so much that, and I feel like I hope I was humble at the time, but certainly 10 times more so now, to see how much you can learn from other people and how important it is to think about others and not just about yourself. Those have been life lessons, very important to me, but especially though, just don't give up. It's too easy. Sometimes things become so difficult that the easy path is just throwing in the towel. And that's where having partners, by the way, is so helpful. There were times when our business was just on the very edge of failure, and having a friend and a partner and saying, you know what, we're just not going to give up was very important.
Chris, I know, I think of you, you're like my dad in that my dad's a big game thinker. He loves big ideas. So send us off from this panel with a crazy idea, whether it has anything to do with China, whether it has anything to do with education or not. But when you, I know every now and then when we catch up, it feels like you've always got a big thought about something, a wild idea, as we call them at Ozzy. What wild idea have you been thinking about, or would you love to see discussed or even executed on?
Yeah, you know, I don't know that it's a single idea, but I'd say thematically right now, what we see in the United States, and I think you'll see it in other countries as well. In the United States, we have a higher education system that's roughly about $500 billion a year of spending in, call it the broad four-year college space in the United States. So very, very large marketplace, but it's incredibly insular. That is, it has not changed dramatically. And for the last roughly 40 years, I would say it has never seen a rainy day. It has always been up and to the right. So enrollments have increased, the ability to charge students have increased, the outcomes associated with education have been positive, government has been supportive of it, and as such, higher education in the United States has been a place of very, very little innovation and insular behavior where everything that takes place inside the circle of that in particular institution. And I think if we looked as a generational matter, my own feeling is that for the next 20 years, we will see that enterprise be torn apart, and that the basics will still be there at some level, but we have 3,000 four-year schools in the United States, each one an island of education, and that $500 billion enterprise will be reconstituted in commercial, non-commercial, and reconstructed ways. And if there was a place that I personally would want to spend my time, it's in that reconstructing of higher education.
Maybe that's your $100 billion company there.
Could be.
Or one of them. Ladies and gentlemen, I told you they were going to be great. Please, a big hand for Doug Becker and Chris Hoehn-Saric. I now think we will get a little break. Enjoy.